By 76, most folks are worrying about prescriptions, health insurance, and whether the grandkids will remember to call on Sunday. Up on a lonely stretch of the Blue Ridge, a widowed woman thought that was all she had left too, until a stormy night when she heard a tiny cry under her porch. She bent down and found a soot-covered kitten shivering in the ashes of a recent wildfire, and carried him inside like a last unexpected blessing. For a while, that little life pulled her out of her grief until he started growing. And growing. By month 4, he was shaking the whole cabin, and one look from the town vet shattered her world. "Ma'am, that's not a house cat. That's a mountain lion cub." From that moment on, this wasn't just a story about a lonely grandma and her pet. It became a battle between love and the law that would force an entire system to change. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Most mornings, the cabin woke up before Maggie did. The old floorboards popped and sighed as the sun pushed a thin slice of light through the pines and across her bedroom wall. The little radio on the nightstand came on with the 6 a.m. news, just like her late husband Hank had programmed it years ago, back when he still remembered how to work the buttons. Now, the announcer's voice filled the room, talking about gas prices, health insurance, and some winter storm out west. But there was no one left to complain about it, except Maggie and the creak of her own bones. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, feeling for her slippers with toes that went a little numb when the weather changed. The air had that Blue Ridge chill to it, the kind that went straight through the windows no matter how much you paid for home insulation or home insurance. Out here, on that narrow gravel road that wound up the mountain, it felt like the rest of the world had forgotten she existed. If not for the pill bottles lined up by the sink and the Medicare card in her wallet, she might have believed she'd slipped right off the map. The cabin was quiet, the way houses get quiet after too many goodbyes. Hank's recliner still faced the television, a thin film of dust softening the arms where his hands used to rest. His favorite flannel shirt hung on the hook by the door, the sleeves empty, the pattern faded from too many washings and not enough wearing. Maggie passed it on the way to the kitchen and, as always, had to stop herself from reaching out and smoothing the collar, the way she used to before they drove into town for church or to meet with the man from the life insurance company. She made coffee because it was something to do with her hands, measured exactly 1 scoop and a half, poured the water, listened to the familiar drip and hiss. The old machine gurgled like it was tired of trying, same as she was. By the time the mug warmed her fingers, the radio had moved onto advertisements for retirement plans and medical alert systems, all those things meant to keep people, like her, safe and sound. Maggie snorted softly. "Safe and sound," she murmured. Safe from what? Sound for who? On the wall above the table, 2 framed photographs watched her eat her toast. In one, David stood in his graduation gown, Chicago skyline blurred behind him. In the other, Lisa held a beach ball, Florida sun turning her hair gold. They had their own homes now, their own mortgages and home security systems, and kids' college funds to worry about. They called on Sundays when they remembered, voices coming through the cell phone like they were already halfway gone. "Mom, you can't live up there forever," David had said the last time they talked. "You're 76. You should think about selling the place, getting a reverse mortgage, something. Come stay with us. You can't just sit in that cabin with Dad's old stuff." She'd told him she'd think about it. Then she'd hung up and looked around the cabin, the scarred wooden table, the stove with one stubborn burner, the sewing machine in the corner where she'd spent 40 years hemming wedding gowns and prom dresses for every girl in the county. This was the only place that still knew her name without having to check a file. By late afternoon, the light turned thin and blue, slipping early behind the ridge. Maggie pulled on a sweater and shuffled to the front window. The pines marched down the slope in dark rows, their branches still blackened in spots from the brush fire that had come too close 2 weeks before. The firefighters had managed to push it back, but the smoke had hung over the mountain for days. They said the wildlife would be restless for a while, driven lower, looking for food and shelter. Mr. Earl from the next property over had already called twice to complain. "Heard coyotes last night," he'd grumbled over the landline, voice crackling. "Something bigger, too. You lock your trash cans, Maggie? These hills don't care how old you are." She'd laughed it off then, but tonight the wind had a mean edge to it, and the sky looked bruised and heavy. The weather report on the radio mentioned more rain, maybe thunder. Great, she thought. More creaks, more leaks, more hours of listening to her own heart beat too loudly in an empty room. After dinner, soup from a can and half a grilled cheese because cooking for one felt like an argument she kept losing, she washed her dishes, turned off the lights, and let the cabin settle into its nighttime shape. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the old clock, the low murmur of the television news talking to itself in the background. She checked the deadbolt, even though nobody came up this far without a reason, and shuffled toward the bedroom, hand tracing along the wall the way you do when you've walked the same route 1,000 times. Outside, the rain started as a soft patter on the metal roof, then built into something harder, angrier. The gutters overflowed, water drumming down, swirling, sheets. Somewhere in the woods, a branch cracked and fell, a sound like a distant gunshot. Maggie paused in the hallway and listened, her old heart giving a little jump. Then she shook her head at herself and kept going. The mountains made noises, that was what they did. She was halfway to turning off the last lamp when she heard it. At first she thought it was the wind catching under the eaves, making that high, whining sound the way it did in January. But then it came again, thin and sharp, almost swallowed by the storm, a small, desperate cry right under the front porch, like something tiny was being squeezed by the dark. Maggie froze, fingers hovering over the switch. The rain hammered the roof, thunder rolled across the ridge, and under all of it, that sound trembled again. Not the yip of a coyote, not the hoot of an owl. Something smaller, weaker. "Now what on earth?" she whispered. The cabin, which had felt so empty for so long, suddenly seemed to be holding its breath with her. For a moment Maggie thought about pretending she hadn't heard it. At 76 she had learned that some sounds were better ignored, branches scraping the roof, pipes knocking, her own heart beating too loud in an empty house. But that thin little cry came again, pressed up under the roar of the storm, and it hit a place in her chest that still remembered what it felt like to comfort a baby at 3 a.m. She grabbed Hank's old flashlight from the hook by the door and shrugged into her raincoat. The porch light flicked on with a stubborn buzz. Rain was blowing sideways, cold needles against her cheeks. She braced one hand on the railing and leaned over, aiming the beam down toward the steps. "Hello?" she called, feeling silly. "Is somebody out there?" The flashlight picked up water pouring off the edge of the roof, the slick boards of the porch, the muddy patch of earth beneath the bottom step. For a second, there was nothing. Then, right where the dirt turned to ash from the recent fire, something moved, a small, shivering lump the color of wet smoke. Maggie sucked in a breath. It was a kitten, she thought at first glance. Tiny, soaked, its fur clumped with soot and mud. It let out another weak sound, more like a whimper than a meow, and tried to drag itself closer to the house. One back leg didn't seem to be working right. "Oh, honey," she whispered, her heart already walking out ahead of her common sense. She eased herself down the steps, knees protesting, rain soaking into her slippers. Up close, the little creature looked even worse. Its sides fluttered with fast, panicked breaths. The paws were too big for its body, splayed awkwardly. Its ears were pointed and tall, the tips darker, almost black. When her flashlight caught its eyes, they flashed a startling gold, wild and bright, before the lids drooped again. Maggie slipped her hands under its small body. It was warmer than she expected, all wiry muscle and trembling bones. The kitten, or whatever it was, gave a tiny, broken sound, but didn't fight her. She tucked it against her chest, inside her coat, feeling its heartbeat stumble against her ribs. "All right, I've got you," she murmured. "Let's get you inside before we both catch pneumonia. I don't think Medicare covers being foolish in a thunderstorm." Back in the cabin, the warmth hit them like a blanket. She set the little bundle on the kitchen counter and went hunting in the hall closet. After a moment's digging, she found the soft blue scarf she'd been knitting for Hank the winter before he died. She'd never finished it. It still held the loop where she'd stopped the day the phone rang from the hospital. Her fingers hesitated over it, then she shook her head and brought it back to the kitchen. "Guess it's time you did some good after all," she said, wrapping the scarf around the tiny body, tucking in the edges like a swaddling cloth. She pulled her old sewing basket down from the shelf, dumped out the spools of thread and loose buttons, and lined it with an old dish towel. The kitten fit perfectly inside, just a little lump under the blue wool. When she brushed soot away from its face, it blinked up at her, those strange eyes trying to focus. "You came crawling out of the ashes, didn't you?" Maggie murmured. "Ash, that's what I'll call you." The name settled over the basket as naturally as the scarf had. Ash. Small, smoky, left over after something bigger burned through. She warmed water on the stove, mixed it with a little canned milk and a spoonful of plain yogurt, the best she could do at midnight on a mountain, and drew it up into a clean syringe from her pill organizer. She'd seen enough late-night commercials about pet insurance and veterinary plans to know this wasn't exactly textbook care, but the nearest veterinary clinic was 40 minutes down the mountain in good weather, and the storm was still pounding the roof. "Open up, sweetheart," she coaxed, easing the syringe to the tiny mouth. To her surprise, Ash latched on with a fierceness that made her smile. Little paws, too big for that small body, pushed weakly against her hand as it swallowed. Milk dribbled down its chin. She'd wiped it away with the corner of the scarf, feeling oddly proud, the way she had when David had taken his first bottle, without spitting it all back up. They went on like that for a while, feed a little, rest a little. The storm grumbled and rolled away toward another ridge. Somewhere after 1 a.m, Ash gave a deep, shaky sigh and slumped into sleep, belly round, breath finally steady. Maggie sat there at the table, watching its sides rise and fall, afraid that if she looked away, it might just vanish, like all the other things that had slipped out of her life when she wasn't paying attention. "You picked the wrong porch," she told it softly. "Old woman, fixed income, no savings for. Fancy pet care, just enough life insurance to bury me and pay off the electric bill." Ash twitched an ear, the dark tip flicking like a burnt match. "But you're here now," she went on, "and as long as you're here, I guess I'm not completely by myself, am I?" She carried the basket into the living room and set it on the little table beside Hank's recliner. For a second, the sight of that empty chair and the blue scarf wrapped around a stranger's tiny body almost undid her. Then Ash snuffled in its sleep, a faint, rumbling sound that might have been the beginning of a purr, and the ache in her chest shifted into something else. Maggie sank into the recliner, the springs groaning in familiar protest, and pulled a light throw over her knees. The TV flickered quietly, forgotten infomercials selling home security systems and miracle vitamins to people just like her. She wasn't listening. Her eyes stayed on the basket, on the small rise and fall under the scarf. In the dim light, with the storm finally fading and the cabins of the mountain tucked into their own dark, it almost felt like the house was breathing again. "Sleep, little Ash," she whispered, letting her head tip back. "We'll figure the rest out tomorrow." If she noticed that the paws hanging over the edge of the basket seemed awfully large for a kitten, or that the rounded ears had just a hint of wildness to their shape, she told herself it was only the shadows playing tricks. Tonight all that mattered was that for the first time in a long time she wasn't falling asleep alone. In the weeks after the storm, the cabin slipped into a new rhythm, one that ticked by in tiny paws and feeding times instead of news reports and pill schedules. Maggie set her phone alarm to buzz every few hours, even at night, so she could warm a little milk, fill the syringe, and tuck it between Ash's sharp, eager teeth. More than once, she caught herself smiling at the ridiculousness of it. 76 years old, up at 3 in the morning like a new mother again, except this baby had fur and feet too big for his own good. Ash got stronger faster than she expected. The first time he climbed out of the sewing basket on his own, she clapped like he'd taken his first steps. He wobbled across the living room, dragging the blue scarf behind him like a royal cape, then flopped down right in the center of Hank's old recliner, as if it had always belonged to him. When he tried to purr, the sound came out rough and low, more like a tiny engine than a house cat, and it made Maggie's chest ache in a way that felt, for once, more sweet than sad. With Ash to think about, she forgot to count her aches and pains quite so often. She still went to her doctor's appointment down in town, of course. She wasn't foolish enough to ignore her heart. While the nurse wrapped the blood pressure cuff around her arm and the doctor talked about Medicare coverage and health insurance options, Maggie found her mind drifting back up the mountain, wondering if Ash had stayed in his basket or decided to explore the kitchen counter. When the doctor said, surprised, that her numbers looked better than last time, she only smiled and thought, I guess bottle feeding a stray is cheaper than a gym membership or a fancy retirement plan. Word about the fire kitten made its way down the road faster than she expected. One Saturday, as she wrestled 2 heavy bags of groceries out of the trunk, a skinny girl in an oversized hoodie trotted up the drive. "Let me help you with that, Ms. Cole," she said, grabbing a bag before Maggie could protest. This was Jenny from 3 cabins down, the one who always had her phone in her hand, earbuds dangling, thumbs busy. Inside, Ash popped his head up over the arm of the recliner, scarf askew. Jenny's mouth fell open. "Oh my gosh, you really did adopt a kitten after the wildfire." She switched her phone to camera mode without thinking, filming Maggie, scooping Ash up, kissing the top of his sooty head, laughing when he batted at her glasses. "My followers are gonna love you," Jenny said. "This is like peak internet." Maggie didn't know much about peak internet, but later that evening, Jenny sent her a link. There she was, on a tiny screen, rocking Ash like a baby, while text across the clip read, "My 76-year-old neighbor adopted a kitten after the wildfire." The little numbers at the bottom kept jumping, views, likes, hearts. It was strange to think that people in places she'd never see, paying mortgages on houses in cities she'd never visit, were watching her old hands stroke that small, smoky head. For the first time in years, she didn't feel completely invisible. Ash, for his part, seemed determined to fill every empty space she had. By the end of the first month, he no longer fit in the sewing basket. His legs dangled over the edge, paws big as $half. He learned to chase the beam of her flashlight along the floor, skidding into chair legs and sending rugs askew. When she sat at the kitchen table to balance her checkbook and worry about home insurance rates and the electric bill, he sprawled across the bills, batting at her pen until she gave up and rubbed his belly instead. And yet, there were little things that didn't quite match the picture of a house cat in her mind. His ears stayed tall and sharp at the tips, with a smudge of dark on each that looked almost painted on. His tail, what there was of it, seemed shorter than it should be, thick and powerful. When a squirrel darted past the living room window one afternoon, Ash went absolutely still, every muscle tensed, eyes locked on the movement with a focus that sent a small shiver down her back. One evening, Mr. Earl stopped by to drop off some eggs, his boots leaving muddy prints on her porch. Ash was lounging in a patch of sunlight by the door, already longer and heavier than any kitten had a key. Right to be. Earl squinted down at him, scratching his stubbled chin. "That the little stray from the fire?" he asked. "That's my Ash," Maggie said proudly. "Found him under the porch. Poor thing would have frozen." Earl grunted. "Poor thing's got paws like a bobcat and eyes like he's thinking about eating my chickens." He gave her a half-serious look. "You sure that's a regular house cat, Maggie? These mountains spit out all kinds of things after a fire." She laughed, a little too loudly. "Don't be dramatic, Earl. He's just big-boned, like Hank was." But that night, when the cabin had gone quiet and Ash curled up on her feet at the end of the bed, she traced the outline of one round ear in the dark and felt the faint thrum of his peculiar, rumbling purr. The sensible part of her, the part that remembered reading an article about wildlife laws and needing a lawyer if you messed around with protected animals, whispered that maybe she should drive him down to the vet and ask a few questions. Then Ash shifted, pressing his warm weight against her ankles, and the loneliness that had lived in her bones since Hank's last hospital bill settled a little deeper into the mattress. She told herself there was time, for now he was just her kitten from the ashes, the unexpected life that had wandered onto her porch when she needed something to keep her going. Outside, the ridge rose dark and watchful against the sky. Somewhere in the trees, something wild called once, and then fell silent. Inside the cabin, two hearts beat steady and slow, both of them believing, at least for a little while longer, that this strange little family could stay exactly as it was. By the time April rolled around, winter had mostly loosened its grip on the Blue Ridge. The snowmelt turned the little creek behind the cabin into a busy ribbon of water, and the air smelled like wet leaves and pine sap. Inside the cabin, though, it felt like a whole different season for just one reason. Ash refused to stay small. He no longer fit on the back of Hank's recliner. Now he took the whole chair, spilling over the arms, big paws dangling. When he jumped down, the old springs groaned, and the floorboards gave a little answering shake. Maggie told herself the cabin was just getting older, same as she was, but every time Ash trotted past, the pictures on the wall rattled a bit. One morning she watched him from the kitchen window while the coffee pot hissed. Ash was out in the yard, the blue scarf long since demoted to chew toy. He stalked across the patchy grass with a low, rolling gait that reminded her of big cats she'd seen on nature shows. In one sudden burst, he pounced on a fallen branch the size of a broom handle, clamped his jaws around it, and dragged it clear across the yard like it weighed nothing at all. "Good grief," she murmured. "You're built like a linebacker, not a lap cat." When he ran from one end of the living room to the other chasing a ball of yarn, he covered the distance in 2 strides. One evening, leaping after his own reflection in the dark glass of the TV screen, he misjudged and slammed into the sideboard. A set of dishes she'd had since before the kids were born rattled dangerously. He landed, shook himself, and looked absolutely delighted. Maggie, on the other hand, pressed a hand to her chest until her heart calmed down. The worst was the night with the pantry. She'd tossed a little rubber mouse for him, and he'd gone after it with his usual enthusiasm. But instead of stopping when the toy hit the pantry door, he went right up the wood, claws out. The sound, long, tearing, deep, shot straight through her. When she snapped on the light, 4 ragged grooves ran almost the full height of the door. She ran her fingers through them, feeling how deep they went into the old pine. "That's not kitten scratch deep," she whispered. Images she'd seen on TV flickered through her mind. Warning posters at the post office about wildlife, a segment on local news about mountain lions and game laws. Somewhere in the fine print they'd mentioned fines, lawyers, even jail time if you kept a wild animal. She thought of her tiny savings, her life insurance policy, the stack of medical bills in the drawer, and felt cold all over. The next morning, Mr. Earl pulled into her drive in his pickup, dust flying. He climbed out holding his phone like it was a piece of evidence. "You seen this?" he demanded. On the screen was a picture he'd posted to the town's Facebook group the night before, a blurry shape at the edge of his chicken coop, long and low, eyes glowing in the flash. The caption read, "Something big prowling up here, chickens disappearing. Anybody missing a pet?" "You think that's Ash?" Maggie asked, stomach tightening. "I think," Earl said slowly, "that whatever that is, it's got paws like your kitten and a taste for free-range chicken. Folks in town are talking. Game warden's niece follows our page. You might want to think about taking that animal to a vet before somebody calls Fish and Wildlife or an attorney." That thought sat heavy with her all afternoon. It weighed more than groceries, more than the little bundle of mail full of health insurance notices and offers for home warranty plans. Finally, she picked up the phone and called the veterinary clinic down in town. "Bring him in," the receptionist said. "Dr. Lopez is here all day. We'll take a look." Getting Ash into the car was an adventure by itself. He barely fit in the old pet carrier she'd borrowed from a neighbor, and he made his opinion about it very clear. By the time she backed down the gravel drive, her arms ached, and her heart was thumping hard enough to make her watch the road extra carefully. 40 minutes of curves and switchbacks later, she pulled into the gravel lot in front of the small tan building with a faded sign, "Blue Ridge Veterinary Care." The waiting room went quiet when she walked in. A couple with a beagle puppy stared. An older man with a terrier lifted his eyebrows. The carrier in Maggie's hands shook as Ash shifted his weight, the metal groaning. "Ms. Cole?" A young man in scrubs, Noah, according to his badge, hurried over. "Let me help you with that." He took the carrier from her, and for a moment his arms dropped a half-inch under the unexpected weight. His eyes flicked to hers, then back to the crate. "Wow. Big boy, huh? How old did you say he was?" 4 months, Maggie said, the words tasting strange now that she heard them out loud. "Found him after the fire." Noah's brow furrowed, but he just nodded and led them to an exam room. A few minutes later, Dr. Elena Lopez came in, her dark hair pulled back, stethoscope around her neck. She smiled at Maggie first, warm and kind, then turned to the carrier. "Let's meet this famous internet kitten," she said. "My niece follows that Jenny girl who posted about you. You're a bit of a local celebrity." Maggie tried to smile, but it wobbled. Noah unlatched the door. Ash flowed out of the carrier like poured muscle, landing on the exam table with a heavy thump. He stood there, tail stump twitching, ears tall and dark-tipped, eyes narrowed against the bright light. For a long moment nobody said anything. Dr. Lopez stepped closer, moving slowly, her expression changing as she took in the size of his paws, the strength in his shoulders, the pattern of his fur, the set of his jaw. She gently lifted a lip to check his teeth, then let it fall. Noah, standing behind her, had quietly pulled up a page of animal pictures on the computer. House cats, bobcats, mountain lions. His eyes moved from the screen to Ash and back again, and the color drained from his face. Maggie gripped the edge of her chair. "Well?" she asked, her voice thin. "He's just big for his age, right? Hank was big-boned too. Maybe it runs in the family." Dr. Lopez turned slowly to look at her, and in that look Maggie saw something she hadn't felt since the day a heart specialist in a white coat had used words like "serious" and "we'll do what we can" about Hank. "Ms. Cole," she said softly, "Ash is not a house cat, not even a big one." The room seemed to tilt. Maggie swallowed. "Then what is he?" Dr. Lopez glanced once more at the powerful young animal on her table, then back at the woman who had bottle-fed him on a mountain. "He's a mountain lion cub," she said, "a cougar, and by month 4. This is exactly why he just keeps growing." For a long moment, the only sound in the exam room was Ash's low, restless breathing. Mountain lion. The words just hung there, big as the animal on the table. "That can't be right," Maggie managed. "He sleeps on my feet. He chases yarn. He purrs." Dr. Lopez's voice stayed gentle, but it didn't soften the facts. "He imprinted on you the way a kitten would, but his biology doesn't care how you found him. Under the law, he's wildlife, a predator. And in North Carolina, you can't keep a cougar in your living room." Maggie thought of the scratched pantry door, the way her dishes had rattled when he hit the sideboard. She thought of Earl's blurry photo at the chicken coop. "What happens now?" she asked, though some part of her already knew. "I'm required to notify Fish and Wildlife," Dr. Lopez said. "There's a center in Tennessee that specializes in big cats. They can take him, evaluate whether he can be rehabbed or needs to live in human care long term. But he can't go back up that mountain with you. It's not safe, and it's not legal. If something happened—" She hesitated. "You could be sued. Your home insurance wouldn't touch that. You'd need a lawyer before you could blink." The mention of lawsuits and attorneys made Maggie's stomach twist. Her savings were thin, her life insurance policy was meant for burial and a little something for the kids, not for defending herself in court because she'd loved the wrong creature. She nodded as if from far away, while forms were printed and signatures were taken. Noah carried Ash back to the car, his usual joke swallowed by the weight of it all. On the drive home, the mountain road blurred. Ash lay quiet in the carrier, golden eyes tracking every turn. When they pulled into the gravel beside the cabin, she sat for a long time with her hands on the steering wheel, listening to the ticking engine and her own shallow breaths. The phone started ringing before she even got him through the front door. She ignored it long enough to let Ash out. He bounded into the living room, tail stump twitching, and leaped into Hank's chair like nothing had changed. Then she picked up. "Mom?" David's voice came sharp from Chicago. No hello, no how are you. "What is this I'm seeing on Facebook? Earl posted some picture. And my cousin tagged me. Are you seriously keeping a mountain lion in your house?" Maggie closed her eyes. "I just found out today. The vet told me. They're sending someone from Fish and Wildlife. He'll have to go to a center." "You think?" David's tone was halfway between panic and anger. "Mom, this is insane. You could get hurt. A neighbor could get hurt. They could sue you. Do you understand what that means? You'd lose the cabin. Your Medicare and Social Security won't cover a lawsuit, for God's sake." "I didn't know," she said quietly. "When I found him, he was the size of my slipper." "Intent doesn't matter to an attorney," he shot back. "You always told us that about signing contracts and mortgages, remember? You need to let them come take it. And then you need to sell that place and move somewhere reasonable. A retirement community. Florida, somewhere with security cameras and a nurse on every keys floor." "I'm not leaving my home," she said, more sharply than she intended. "Well, you can't keep a lion as a roommate either," he snapped. There was a long exhale on his end. When he spoke again, his voice was tired. "Look, I have a meeting. We'll talk tonight. Just don't do anything crazy, okay?" She hung up without promising. By late afternoon, the knock came. A white truck with a state seal pulled up behind Earl's pickup. Earl himself hovered at the edge of the yard with his arms folded, watching like a man who'd called in the cavalry and wanted to be sure they did their job. The man on the porch introduced himself as Tyler Brooks, North Carolina Fish and Wildlife. He was younger than she expected, early 30s maybe, with sunlines around his eyes and a clipboard in his hand. "Ms. Cole," he said, hat in hand, "mind if I come in and talk a minute?" "I suppose you're coming in whether I mind or not," she said, but she stepped aside. Ash lifted his head from the recliner as they entered, pupils narrowing at the stranger. Tyler's eyes flicked to him and stayed there for a heartbeat too long. Even in repose, Ash looked nothing like a house cat now. "You see what I'm dealing with," Maggie said, the words coming out more brittle than she'd planned. "He thinks that chair is his mama." Tyler's mouth tugged, not quite a smile. "He's a handsome animal, but he is an animal that, grown, can weigh over 150 pounds, clear a 6-foot fence, and take down a deer. If he decided to swipe at you, even by accident—" "I know," she said, cutting him off. "The vet explained all about liability and game laws and all the ways I could end up needing an attorney I can't afford." He glanced around the small cabin, taking in the worn furniture, the family photos, the pill bottles by the sink. "I'm not here to judge you, ma'am," he said quietly. "You did what a lot of people would do when they find a helpless thing on their porch. But now, we all know what he is. That means I have to act." "So that's it?" she asked. "You just take him?" "There'll be a formal notice," he said. "He'll be transported to the center in Tennessee. They have proper enclosures, veterinary staff, everything. It's a good place as far as these places go." "And me?" she asked. "What do I get?" He hesitated. "Peace of mind that your neighbors are safe, and that you're not going to be on the hook if something bad happens." Maggie looked at Ash, who had sat up now, ears pricked, sensing the tension in the room. He hopped down and came to lean against her legs, that heavy, solid weight she'd come to depend on. She rested a hand between his shoulder blades, feeling the power packed there, the steady thump of his wild heart. "I already lost one man I loved in this room," she said softly. "Losing this one is not going to give me peace of mind, Mr. Brooks." Tyler's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed kind. "I'm sorry," he said. "I truly am. But if we don't do this the right way, someone else might come along who's not as gentle about it. And then nobody wins. Not you, not your neighbors, and certainly not him." Out in the yard, Earl shifted his weight from one boot to the other, watching the door. In town, people scrolled past Jenny's videos and Earl's warnings, offering armchair advice about wildlife laws and crazy mountain folks. In Chicago, David probably sat in a conference room looking at his phone, wondering how quickly his mother's quiet life had turned into something that might require a police report and a stack of legal papers. Inside the little cabin on Blue Ridge, Maggie patted the big, smoky head at her side and felt the future closing in. They came for Ash 3 days later, on a gray morning that never quite turned into day. The clouds hung low over the ridge, scraping the tops of the pines as if the mountain itself didn't want to see what was about to happen. Tyler arrived in the white state truck, this time with a second vehicle behind him. A boxy transport van with the logo of the Tennessee Wildlife Center stamped on the side. 2 men in heavy gloves and canvas jackets climbed out, carrying a large steel crate between them. The metal clanged against the porch steps, the sound sharp as a slammed door. Maggie had tried to prepare herself. She'd washed Ash's scarf, even though he mostly ignored it now, and packed his worn rubber mouse in a small grocery bag as if he were a child going off to camp instead of a wild animal being taken into custody. Her hands wouldn't quite stop shaking. Inside, Ash paced by the front window, already restless. He knew something was wrong. She could feel it in the way his body brushed her knees, in the way his eyes flicked from her to the door and back again. "We'll sedate him lightly," one of the men said, setting the crate down with a final thud. "Just to make it safer for everybody." "He's never hurt me," Maggie said, but her voice didn't have much fight in it. Tyler met her eyes. "We know you've done right by him," he said quietly, and we're going to try to do right by him too. That's a promise." They gave Ash a small injection in the muscle of his hind leg. He flinched, then spun as if to protest, but Maggie's hands were already on his shoulders, steadying him. She murmured nonsense into his fur, the way she had when he was small enough to fit in a sewing basket. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "You're just going for a ride, like a field trip. You'll be brave." The sedative made his movements slow and clumsy, as if gravity had suddenly doubled. When they guided him toward the crate, he stumbled, and for one terrible moment he turned his head and tried to climb back toward her, claws scrabbling on the metal. The sound went through her like a knife. Jenny stood, near the porch rail, white-faced, her phone hovering in the air. She hadn't meant to film, she said later, but her fingers had moved on their own. The camera caught everything. The big cat pushed gently but firmly into the crate, the door clanging shut, the way his paws hit the bars in slow motion as the sedative dragged him down. It caught Maggie's hand pressed to the wire, her lips moving in prayer or apology. No one could really tell. When the van pulled away, gravel spitting under its tires, Ash's muffled, confused cry rose up and then faded as the curve of the road took him out of sight. The sound lingered in the trees long after the vehicle disappeared. The cabin felt bigger after that, but not in any of the good ways people talked about in real estate ads. The empty recliner, the quiet floorboards, the blue scarf folded neatly on the armrest. Everything seemed to hum with the space Ash had filled. That night, Maggie made herself a sandwich, took 2 bites, and put it down. Her stomach felt like it was full of stones. The next morning, she tried to do normal things, paid the electric bill online, shuffled through mail full of health insurance offers and low-interest credit card applications she didn't need. By afternoon, the words on the page blurred. She went to the little market in town for milk and bread, because that was what you did when you didn't know what else to do. She never remembered the moment her knees gave out. One second she was standing in front of the canned goods, thinking absently that she should check her life insurance beneficiary forms like the brochure had suggested. The next, she was on the floor, people's faces looming above her, someone saying her name over and over. The ride in the ambulance was a smear of sirens and cold air. At the hospital, a nurse clipped something to her finger and talked about blood pressure, stroke risk, Medicare copays. A doctor with kind eyes said her heart looked stressed but not broken. But he frowned when he spoke about how little she'd been eating, how much weight she'd lost. "It isn't just her heart we're treating," she heard him say outside the curtain. "It's her being alone. Grief, stress, everything catches up. She needs rest. She needs support." Support, she thought dimly, staring at the ceiling tiles. Support was 4 furry feet thumping down the hallway at the sound of her voice. Support had golden eyes and a rumbling purr. Several states away, at the center in Tennessee, Ash did not adjust. The first day he paced from one end of his enclosure to the other, flanks heaving, calling out in low, horrible sounds that made the staff wince. He ignored the bowl of meat pushed through the slot, pawed at the gate until his pads bled, then finally collapsed in a corner, sides rising and falling in ragged breaths. By day 3, he still hadn't eaten. Dr. Kamal, the behavior specialist, stood with a clipboard, watching him through the mesh. "This isn't good," he said to the head keeper. "He's imprinted on a human caregiver. Pulling him away that abruptly, it's a shock. Stress like this can kill, even with the best veterinary care." "Can we sedate and tube feed?" the keeper asked. "For a while," Kamal said, "but we can't do that forever. And if he remains this fixated on humans, we certainly can't release him. He's too young to have learned to hunt properly, too tame to fear people, too dangerous to be a pet." The word none of them wanted to say hovered in the air anyway. euthanasia. It came up in a staff meeting a week later, low and grim, as they went over budget, enclosure space, the list of animals already waiting for a spot. Tyler had driven down for the day to check on Ash's progress, and he happened to be walking past the open door when he heard it. "If he doesn't turn around soon," someone was saying, "we'll have to think about humane options. We're not a sanctuary for hopeless cases. We're a rehab facility." "Hopeless," another voice echoed. "Sad situation, but we can't save them all." Tyler stopped in the hallway, hand flat against the wall. He could still see Maggie's lined face in that little cabin, the way she'd stood between him and the big cat, like a mother defending her child. The idea of walking back up that mountain road to tell her they'd not only taken Ash, but put him down, it made his stomach twist. That evening, instead of heading straight back to his state-issued motel, he went to the off-site office where the staff kept their records. He asked to see the latest footage from the enclosure cameras. On the screen, Ash was a shadow of the powerful, curious animal he'd seen leaping around the cabin. The young cougar lay flat on the concrete, head between his paws, eyes dull. When a keeper set down a fresh bowl of food, he turned his head away. Tyler sat there for a long time, staring. Later, he copied a short clip onto his tablet. 2 days after that, he walked into the small-town hospital in Blue Ridge, hat in his hands, the tablet tucked under his arm. The nurse at the desk showed him to Maggie's room. She looked smaller in the bed than she ever had in that cabin, hospital gowns swallowing her shoulders, and IV lines snaking into the thin skin of her hand. "Did they send you to arrest me for fainting in the soup aisle?" she asked, managing a weak smile. "No, ma'am," he said. "I came because you deserve to know how he's doing." He pulled a chair close and opened the tablet. On the screen, the image of Ash appeared, the bare walls of the enclosure, the motionless body in the corner, the untouched food. Maggie's hand flew to her mouth. For a long moment she said nothing, just watched. Then her eyes filled. "He thinks I just gave him away," she whispered, "like a piece of old furniture, like he didn't mean anything." Tyler's throat tightened. "He's grieving, same as you," he said softly. "We're trying, but he won't eat. He just lies there. They're talking about options I don't want them to talk about." She kept staring at the screen, tears sliding sideways into her hair. When she spoke again, her voice had a strength he hadn't heard since the day they met. "If he dies thinking I abandoned him," she said, each word careful and clear, "I don't think I could live with that, not with everything else I've already lost." And just like that, something shifted in the room, the fragile, dangerous beginning of an idea that would drag them both into the heart of a storm neither of them had planned on facing. The storm rolled in the way mountain storms do, fast and mean. By late afternoon, the sky over Blue Ridge had turned the color of old bruises. Wind pushed against the hospital windows, rattling them in their frames. Snowflakes showed up in the forecast where rain had been that morning, and the weatherman on the tiny wall TV started using phrases like winter advisory and dangerous road conditions. Maggie watched the gray smear outside and clutched the thin blanket a little tighter. Doctors had talked about keeping her a few more days for observation. They'd mentioned follow-up visits, health insurance paperwork, a home care plan. None of it seemed to matter as much as the picture burned into her mind. Ash lying in that concrete box, not eating, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. Tyler showed up just after visiting hours technically ended, hat in his hands again, hair damp from the first bits of snow. The nurse at the desk gave him a look that said, "Make it quick," but she also tucked a blanket around Maggie's feet before she left them alone, as if she knew this conversation mattered more than his job title. "They're talking in circles down there," he said without preamble, dropping into the chair. "Behaviorists, budget meetings, risk assessments." Words like humane options. For him, that's a nice way to say no more chances. Maggie's jaw tightened. So they're going to kill him because he missed a few meals. They're afraid he's too far gone to rehab, Tyler said. Too attached to you to be wild, too wild to be anyone's pet. Liability is all they see. Lawyers, insurance, worst-case scenarios. And what do you see? She asked. He met her eyes. I see a sick animal grieving his person, and I see a woman in this hospital bed grieving the same way. I don't know how to fix all of it, but I know if he dies without seeing you again, both of you will go down with him, one way or another. For a moment, the only sound was the wind. Then Maggie pushed herself a little higher on the pillows. Her voice was thin but steady. Then let me go to him, she said, just once. Let him know I didn't vanish on purpose. Let him smell me, hear my voice. If he dies after that, at least he dies knowing he wasn't thrown away like trash. There are rules, Tyler said automatically, but the words didn't have much force. There were rules when I picked him up off my porch, she said. Fire, wildlife, don't touch. I broke them because my heart couldn't stand the idea of leaving him there. This is the same thing. He scrubbed a hand over his face. Outside, sleet started ticking against the glass. A man who spent his life writing reports and following regulations sat there and weighed his options like a man at the edge of a cliff. If anything goes wrong, he said finally, I lose my job, maybe worse. You understand that? If anything doesn't happen, she replied, I lose whatever's left of my life. You understand that? They held each other's gaze for a long moment. Then Tyler let out a breath that felt like surrender. Can you walk? He asked. Not far, she admitted, but far enough. He signed her out against medical advice, scribbling something on a clipboard about family transport and outpatient follow-up. He helped her into her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and wheeled her out into the biting air. The snow was coming faster now, turning the parking lot into a slick sheet. His state pickup waited by the curb, heater running. Jenny was already in the back seat, bundled in a puffy jacket, phone in hand. Don't yell at me, she said as Maggie shot her a surprised look. I heard him at the nurse's station. If you're going to do something crazy for a lion, you're not doing it alone. Also, she held up the phone. Somebody should document this, in case people in charge need reminding what's actually happening. The drive to Tennessee felt longer than it had any right to be. Snow swirled in the headlights, the road narrowing to 2 ruts of dark asphalt. The wipers thumped. Maggie dozed and woke in fits, each time expecting to see her living room ceiling and hearing Ash's claws tapping on the floor. Each time, all she saw was Tyler's shoulders hunched over the wheel and Jenny's reflection in the window, pale and intent. By the time they reached the center, night had settled in. Security lights cast harsh pools of white over the chain-link fences. The storm had kept some staff from making it in. The front office was manned by one tired-looking guard who recognized Tyler and waved them through with only a brief double-take at the frail woman in the passenger seat. Inside the main building, the hall smelled of disinfectant and damp fur. Somewhere a fox barked sharply, then fell silent. Tyler signed them in, clipped visitor badges on Maggie and Jenny's coats, and led them down a corridor that felt colder than the rest. Let me talk to whoever's on duty, he said. Officially, you're here to see him from outside the enclosure. That's as far as my authority really goes. What about unofficially? Maggie whispered. He didn't answer. The big cat wing was quieter than the others. Most of the animals were curled in their dens, out of sight. The wind howled outside, rattling the metal seams. At the far end of the row, Ash's enclosure loomed, a rectangle of chain link and shadow. A red warning sign hung on the gate, words about danger and liability stark in the harsh light. Ash lay near the back wall, a tawny heap, barely moving. His ribs showed more than they should have. When Tyler opened the outer door and the cold air swept in, Ash's ears flicked, but he didn't lift his head. Maggie pressed her hand to the mesh. "Ash," she called, voice trembling. "Baby, it's Grandma." For a second, nothing happened. Then his head jerked up, as if someone had pulled a string. His nose worked the air, picking up a scent he hadn't smelled since the day the world ended. His eyes, dull moments before, focused on her face. He stood up on shaky legs. "Maggie," Tyler said sharply, seeing the way the big cat's muscles bunched. "Stay back. He's not sedated. If he hits that fence at a run—" But Ash didn't charge the fence. He walked toward it, slow and deliberate, never taking his gaze off her. He reached the mesh, pressed his nose against the cold metal, and made a sound so low and broken it didn't fit any category. Part purr, part sob. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, tears spilling. "I'm so sorry. I didn't leave you on purpose." Jenny had started recording without realizing it, the phone held at chest level, lens catching the old woman's hand and the great golden head on the other side of the fence. Snow blew sideways past the floodlights outside, turning the scene into something out of a movie. Behind them, down the corridor, a buzzer sounded. Someone had opened a service door to deal with an ice buildup, and for a few precious seconds, the interior safety gate of Ash's enclosure didn't latch all the way. The guard on duty had been called away to help with a generator. The storm had stretched everyone thin. Tyler saw the light over the door flicker from red to green and went cold. "That gate," he started. Maggie saw it too. Or maybe she just saw the narrow gap between her and the animal whose life was hanging by a thread, and all the rules in the world shrank behind the sound of his rough, desperate breathing. Before Tyler could stop her, she slipped her frail body through the outer staff door and into the small airlock between the walls of chain link. Her hospital bracelet flashed in the harsh light. Her sensible shoes skidded on the damp concrete, but she kept going, one hand on the mesh for balance. "Maggie," Tyler barked, lunging forward. If she heard him, she gave no sign. Her fingers found the inner latch and pushed. The gate opened 6 inches, then a foot. Cold air and the raw, musky scent of big cat washed over her. She stepped inside. For Jenny, the world narrowed to the rectangle of her screen. The image shook as her hands trembled, the old woman shuffling toward the cougar moving toward her, a thin line of space between them where anything could happen. Ash reached her first. He could have knocked her flat with a careless swat. Instead, he lowered his massive head and pushed it gently against her chest, just below her heart, as if trying to crawl back into the space under her ribs he'd once fit in. His body shuddered with a deep, tremoring sound that wasn't quite a purr and wasn't quite a growl, something ancient and raw. Maggie's arms went around his neck almost automatically. Her fingers disappeared into his thick fur. She pressed her cheek against the top of his head, tears soaking into his coat. "I'm here," she murmured. "I'm here, baby. Grandma's here." From the hallway, Tyler stared, every training manual he'd ever read screaming in the back of his head. One wrong movement, one flash of instinct, and he would be writing reports to justify why a 76-year-old woman had died in a big cat enclosure because he hadn't stopped her. His hand hovered near the tranquilizer alarm button on the wall, but he didn't hit it. Not yet. A keeper came running, then stopped dead at the sight. The cougar pressed against the old woman, her hands moving over his shoulders in familiar, soothing circles. The snarling, cage-pacing animal they knew was gone. In its place was something else, a giant, dangerous predator wrapped around the fragile center of its world, careful as a child. "Bring me the food," Maggie called without looking up. "The good stuff, the chicken he likes." Someone, dazed, did as she asked, pushing a heavy bowl through the slot. Ash lifted his head, sniffed, then looked back at her, as if for permission. She smiled through her tears. "Go on," she whispered. Eat. For me. You hear? For me. He stepped away just far enough to lower his head to the bowl. The first bite seemed to cost him something, but once it was in his mouth, instinct took over. He chewed, swallowed, and then ate again, faster this time, like a starving man finally letting himself admit he was hungry. In the hallway, Jenny's phone kept recording. It captured every second: the wild storm outside, the flicker of the fluorescent lights, the mountain lion eating his first real meal in days because a woman who should have been home checking her Medicare statements and worrying about car insurance instead had walked into his cage. None of them knew it yet, but those shaky, grainy seconds would be watched millions of times. They would be played on morning shows and shared in group chats, studied by lawyers and lawmakers and wildlife experts. They would force people who had never set foot on Blue Ridge to ask themselves what should happen when love and law collided inside a steel fence. For that moment, though, all that mattered was this: an old woman's hand resting on a great golden back, the rise and fall of two chests calming in sync, and the quiet, miraculous sound of a wild animal choosing life again. The video left the center long before any of them had time to think about what it might mean. Jenny uploaded it in the car on the way back, thumbs flying over the screen, tears still drying on her cheeks. She didn't add dramatic music or fancy filters, just a simple caption: "My 76-year-old neighbor broke into a mountain lion cage to save him." By the time they reached the state line, the little heart icon on her phone was blinking faster than a heartbeat. By morning, it had gone from thousands of views to hundreds of thousands. By the end of the week, millions. Talk shows played the clip over mugs of coffee, an old woman in a hospital bracelet, arms around a cougar eating his first good meal in days. News anchors shook their heads, some calling it reckless, others calling it proof that love could show up in the strangest places. Wildlife experts argued on panels about law and liability. Lawyers talked about game regulations and home insurance. A financial advisor on one program even said, "You can plan your retirement savings and health insurance down to the penny, but you can't plan for something like this, a bond that changes everyone's idea of what's possible." Petitions popped up online. One demanded Ash be returned to the wild. Another insisted he stay with Maggie in her cabin. A third, the one that kept growing, said something different: let them stay together safely. Find a way. At the center, administrators watched the storm gather around their little outpost. They were used to working in the quiet, behind fences and forms. Suddenly, reporters were calling, asking for statements. Emails poured in from people who sent $5 with a note or nothing but a story about their own rescued animal. So they did something. Places like that don't do very often. They called a meeting and admitted they didn't have an easy answer. In a long, echoing conference room, people sat around a scarred table. The director of the center, representatives from Fish and Wildlife, Dr. Kamal with his behavior notes, Dr. Lopez on a video screen from Blue Ridge, and Tyler in a wrinkled shirt that looked like it had been through a storm, twice. A lawyer from the state sat quietly in one corner, legal pad open. They watched the video again, this time not as internet fodder, but as evidence. "She walked straight into that enclosure," someone said. "He could have killed her." "But he didn't," Dr. Lopez pointed out. "He did the opposite. He calmed. He ate. That's a behavioral fact we can't ignore." "We can't send a mountain lion back to a cabin on a hill," the director said. "No judge, no insurance company, no attorney in their right mind would sign off on that." "No one's asking you to," Tyler said slowly. "What if the cabin comes here?" They looked at him. "Not literally," he amended, "but what if we stop? Thinking of her as a rogue owner, and think of her as staff. A volunteer, but formal. Trained, screened, living on site in a small cottage. only interacting with Ash, under strict rules, with barriers where needed. Use their story to educate people about why you shouldn't keep wildlife at home, but also about what happens when you care enough to clean up a mistake. It would make us responsible for both of them, the lawyer said. Legally, medically, financially. You're already responsible for him, Tyler replied. And if he dies because we refuse to bend, you'll be responsible for that too, even if the paperwork says otherwise. Silence settled. Outside the windows, the snow had melted, leaving the ground raw and brown. A hawk circled in a wide, unseen loop over the property. Slowly, the director exhaled. A trial period, she said at last. We draft an agreement. She gets cleared by her doctor. No direct contact except under supervision and within safety protocols. She helps with tours, tells her story. We monitor him. We monitor her. If either one suffers, we reassess. And if it works? Someone asked. Then maybe, the director said, we've just written a new kind of policy. Weeks later, when Maggie stepped out of Tyler's truck in front of the little guest cottage on the edge of the center's grounds, spring was nudging its way back into the world. The cottage was nothing fancy, one bedroom, a small living room, a porch with 2 chairs, but the rent was almost nothing, and the contract made it clear her Medicare and Social Security would stretch just fine. Her old cabin on Blue Ridge had been sold with the help of a local real estate agent, the proceeds tucked carefully beside her life insurance policy in a folder David kept in a fireproof box. I still think you're crazy, David had said, standing in her hospital room the day he finally made it down. But if this is what keeps you alive instead of just existing, then I guess that's good retirement planning too. At the big cat area, Ash watched her approach from behind a double layer of mesh. He was heavier now, the bones he'd shown in those dark days at the center padded by proper muscle and good food. When she called his name, he walked along the fence, matching her steps, that old rough purr starting up deep in his chest. School buses began to come, yellow and noisy, full of kids who wanted to see the grandma and her lion. Maggie sat on a bench outside the enclosure, microphone clipped to her collar, and told the story over and over. How she'd found him, how she'd broken the rules out of kindness twice, how in the end she'd had to learn a new way to love him that didn't mean keeping him like a house cat. Wild things should stay wild, she'd say, looking at the children over her glasses. But if you find one hurt and alone, the right way to help is to call people who know what they're doing. Don't drag it into your living room like I did, no matter how much your heart wants to. The kids laughed at that, but they listened. Parents listened too, some of them thinking about their own insurance policies and legal forms, and about the spaces in life that don't fit neatly onto paperwork. One afternoon in early summer, Earl showed up at the center, hat in his hands, boots too clean as if he didn't quite trust the sidewalks. He took the tour with a group of strangers, standing very still when they reached Ash's enclosure, and Maggie stepped out to speak. "Well, I'll be," he muttered when she finished. "You went and turned that overgrown barn cat into a celebrity." "Not just a celebrity," she said, hugging him despite his protests. "A teacher, same as me." Later, when the crowds had gone and the sun was sliding down behind the low hills, Maggie sat on a bench by the fence. Ash paced along the inside, then settled with his side pressed to the mesh. She rested her palm against the cool wire where his heart beat on the other side, steady and strong. "You know," she said softly, "when I was 76, I thought my life was done growing. You were just a little kitten then, and you just kept getting bigger and bigger until I realized why." She chuckled, shaking her head. "Turns out it wasn't just you. My world had some growing left in it, too." The light turned golden, painting the concrete and the fences and the old woman and the great cat in the same warm wash. For a moment, there were no forms, no policies, no lawyers, no arguments on TV. There was just a woman who had given the rest of her days to sit beside a creature the world called dangerous, and a creature who had chosen every single day not to break her. High on the hill, where the security lights couldn't quite reach, the wind stirred the pines in a sound like distant applause. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.